Howdy, folks. Today we're diving into how to create cinematic portraits with simple lighting, what it really takes to get that film style look without overcomplicating your setup. Right after this. Welcome to Camera Shake, where we bring you the insider scoop on all things photography and videography, giving you a unique opportunity to stay ahead of the curve. We've spent literally hundreds of hours interviewing some of the most renowned photographers of our time, giving you access to knowledge and expertise that is just not available anywhere else. Maybe on YouTube, if you look really hard. But as always, I'm your host, Kirsten Nuts, and if you're like me and you enjoy free podcasts and YouTube content, you can support the show by buying us a coffee over on buymeacoffee.com/camerashake to help us create more exciting episodes for you. But of course, you're more than welcome to say no hard feelings at all. Just know that your support really does make a difference. And if you want to represent the show, we've got merch available now over at camerashakepodcast.com, so make sure you go check that out over there. Now, without further ado though, let's give it up for today's special guest, Canon ambassador, photographer, filmmaker, and master of cinematic lighting. Give it up for Clive Booth. Clive, welcome to the show.
Wow, thank you, Kirsten. That's quite a big intro. Hope I can live up to that. But yes, it's a real pleasure to be here, and yeah, thanks for the invite.
Oh, you're absolutely welcome. We ran into each other at a photography show very briefly, and we're going to talk about cinematic lighting in a minute. But just give you sort of an idea as to what you were up to at the show this year.
Oh, this year we did something really new and scary. Which is kind of where I like to be. I like to be outside my comfort zone regularly. I think it's important. And I thought about this idea for some time now about creating a capture to print workflow actually within the show. So it was to have a studio setup and to have Canon image prograph printers, fine art archival printers, and use my camera. So it's actually in connection with my latest project, which I'm sure we can talk about soon, with the Birmingham Royal Ballet. So I had an elite dancer every day on the stage, a little stage, and we created a kind of blackout studio, and it was literally just one light, one camera, and one lens, and roughly 10 people joined me each day. And they would shoot the portraits or full body shots of elite dancers each day. And then those files were put into Adobe Lightroom, and then professional print and layout, which is Canon's print software. And each person went away with a fine art archival print. And we'd given ourselves 2 hours to do this. And if anybody makes fine art archival prints, they'll know that that's quite a challenge. But we managed to do it, and largely because of the preparation. As you know, with any big shoot, it's all about preparation. So a couple of months went into the sort of thinking process and how we planned it. And then having a really great team around me. And that's what made it possible. But what was great was just seeing the looks on people's faces when they went home with a fine art archival print of an elite dancer who it's actually very, very hard to get access to photograph an elite dancer, and to have these amazing fine art archival prints that are archival for 200 years on Hahnemuller fine art paper, printed on the Canon Lucia Pro 2 inks. And it just proved the power of print, which is something I'll talk about probably a little bit more later. So yeah, it was a huge challenge, but it was actually really moving because I handed over the mic to the dancers in many cases, and the dancers talked about their challenges, because many people who had the cameras in their hands came from other walks of life, other areas of photography. So they might be landscape, they might be wildlife. One lady who came does horticultural garden design, and some people actually, their hands were literally shaking. So I said, put your hands up if you're nervous. Everybody put their hand up. And then I handed over the mic to the dancer, and then the dancer would talk about how they managed sort of day-to-day life pressures, stage frights, anxiety. So it became a very human thing, and I love that. I love the fact that photography can do that. Um, so yeah, all in all, a big success, and I was really over the moon with the reaction and response we got to it.
And it was busy. I mean, when I dropped in, it was frantic almost, to say the least.
Yeah, it was kind of an organized chaos, but actually we had a little oasis in a sense because although it was busy all around us, we've got a kind of as you saw, we had a very open space. I think it was something like I think it was 7 meters by 5, something like that. So we had the one part of that was our sort of blackout studio. Well, not quite blackout. We had a roof and a blacked area, and then we had this workflow running along the back wall. But there was a low wall, so what it meant was that the dancers were lit, and they were lit in exactly the same way I'm lit here. Um, and thanks to the lovely people at Godox, they supplied me with these beautiful 2x1 LED light panels, which is actually my preference now for shooting. And we'll come to that again a little bit later with my work with Birmingham Royal Ballet, where I work side stage. You can only work with continuous light, and you have to work in very, very low light. So there was this lovely soft light flooding the dancer, but what it meant was that people who were walking past could actually, also take pictures. So yeah, it created quite an event, really. There was one day, actually, I think it was the second day, where Lucy Wayne joined us, and she had this beautiful costume, this beautiful tutu. It got diamante, and when she stands on point, she's very tall. I'm almost 6 feet, and she was sort of towering above me. And actually, we walked around the stands, and so I had my lighting assistant light her, and we went from all the people I work with through the Canon stand, through Hannah Muller, through Azo and Godox, and we had this huge numbers of people. So I like that. I like that spontaneity, and it was just what was great. It's just a good feeling around it all. It did transcend photography. It became a human interest sort of event, really, because the dancers were really sharing what it meant to be, or what it took to be an elite dancer. Because you only have to look at an elite dancer's body to realize that that's a lifetime of dedication and sacrifice and suffering. I mean, I think Lucy, when she was standing on point one day, I just happened to say to her, what if you were to give me a number between 1 and 10 now, in terms of pain, what are you at? And she said, about 3. I said, okay.
I feel like the human interest story thing was very strong, especially with Canon this year at the show as well. Because I remember, I saw your booth, and then I saw the 3D experience that they had set up. I can't remember what the project was called now, but it was basically a VR
The coral
experience.
spawning.
The coral, yeah, that was unbelievable. I mean, that was very, very cool.
Well, I'm a big fan of VR. In fact, we made the first VR film with Birmingham Royal Ballet 3 years ago, and that was to bring ballet to neurodiverse young people and adults who can't ordinarily get to live theatre. So I forgive the pun, immersed myself in VR for a whole year.
Yeah.
And we were beta testing. We had, at that time, it wasn't what we were trying to do hadn't been done. You couldn't even go on YouTube. You couldn't find anything. So we had to sort of find a way. And thankfully, I had the help of Adobe in California. I had the help of Canon Japan supported me with beta software, and we were able to get 60 frames at 8K at 12-bit. And you can imagine the amount of data we were wrangling on that. But the result was just incredible. But it took me probably 9 months to make a 5.5-minute film. So a bit crazy. You can find it online. There's a whole behind-the-scenes documentary. And I'm still incredibly proud of that film because it, from a quality perspective, from the visual quality, it's extraordinary. But more importantly for me, and as you were just saying, there was a narrative. It followed a dancer's story, her story from a dream of wanting to be a ballerina and then actually becoming a ballerina. And so we created a narrative film in VR, which, because most times when you look at VR, you don't normally see narrative storytelling. You'll see it'll cut from different things, and you get the effect of VR. But actually, narrative storytelling is quite tricky because you have to shoot at certain heights, and then you have to decide when you're going to go close to camera, when you're not going to go close. If you go outside of 3 meters, you lose the sort of 3D effect. So many different technicalities to it. And I absolutely want to do more VR, but the demand for VR, unless you're in that niche area, which we were, and thankfully to Bloomberg, they supported that project and financed it. But it became an award-winning film, which hopefully more people will get to see, and hopefully we'll do more.
And of course, for those of you listening or watching, just check that out, because I'll make sure the link will be in the description, so you can go and check it out after you've finished listening or watching this episode, of course. The VR thing, I tell you what, I spoke to Canon, I want to say 2 years ago, when they first came out with their stereoscopic lenses.
It'll be 3 now.
Oh, 3, even 3 years. Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah,
No, it's crazy.
Yeah.
Yeah. The dual fisheye, lens it came out around, just over 3 years.
And but seeing this, seeing it in action, on like floating across the reef was absolutely phenomenal. Being able to look around, I immediately thought, what I'd love to do is I'd love to shoot like a film noir, crime mystery type of a thing, where you have to find clues yourself, like you have to solve the case, like a whodunit type of a thing. How cool would that be? You just have to look around your 3D environment. Oh, that'd be amazing. Maybe one day. There you go.
Well, you get interestingly, but my film was in a sense kind of film noir because I'm shooting side stage, and of course you can't bring lighting into side stage. Although we'll talk about that a little bit later with the latest project. So I was having to work at. You have 2 ISO sort of settings really that are safe settings, 816. So I was working at 1600 ISO, and then even I think occasionally pushed it even higher. But of course, you're working practically in the dark. So but there was there's this one amazing scene, which literally, and I'm not kidding now, took me probably 2 to 3 months to actually get it to a point at which I was completely happy with it, because we were pushing the boundaries at that point. It's 3 years ago, and of course it was very noisy. The file was very noisy. This is on R5C and with dual fisheye, which is still an amazing camera, by the way. 8K. It's shooting at 60 frames. I'd create this beautiful big rig, and again, I can share pictures and the story of that. But this one scene is just so incredibly beautiful, where I'm in this sort of shooting in the shadows, and there are 2 ballerinas sitting chatting, completely unaware of me, side stage before they go back onto stage. And you can hear the music and you can see the lights, and it's because it's 180 stereoscopic, so you can look up and around. And it's just mesmerizing. But of course, technology's moved on now. So we have better low light capability. And the camera that I use now for the stills that I'm working on side stage, the R5 Mark II, it's unlike anything I've ever used before from the point of low light capability.
So let's talk about lighting for a little bit. Cinematic lighting. Now, when somebody says your cinematic portrait, what does that actually mean to you?
It's a good question, really. I think let's go back a step. So when I was 9 years old, my parents took me to the local museum, Derby Museum, and I'm not a big fan, like all children, I guess, or most children, big fan of going to museums. I find them quite boring, actually. And in fact, even now, if I go to a museum or an art gallery, when I was at art college, I was given a great piece of advice: just focus on one thing and then go and look at that one piece and immerse yourself in it, which I think is great advice. And if you can do more, then great. But I was struck by the the paintings of a local artist, Joseph Wright. And in fact, I think right now they're at the National Gallery. There's an exhibition of his work there. And the work was so extraordinary, the way that he lit these scenes. The scenes are quite macabre in some ways, the gassing of a bird, and there's the sort of looks of horror. There's even children looking with horror, but the lighting is the chiaroscuro, is the sort of three-dimensional lighting, often from a single light source. And that got me so fascinated with light at the age of 9. And I think from that point onwards, I started to look at other great painters. So I guess the next one might have been, the most obvious ones would be Rembrandt. And of course, we all know about, the Rembrandt triangle and, again, the chiaroscuro, the half light. And then I was sort of drawn towards Caravaggio, and I work a lot in Malta. And I remember 10 years ago going to go to the Co Cathedral. If you visit Malta, it's a real must. Go to the Co Cathedral, because that's incredible in itself. But go and have a look at the beheading of, if you want to cheer yourself up, go and have a look at the beheading of John the Baptist. I mean, Caravaggio was a colourful sort of character, but look at the lighting of a Caravaggio. It's just extraordinary. And he kind of goes a step further, where he's got these catch lights in the eyes, which I really love, because I find that sort of engages you with the subject. And so then I guess the other one would be Vermeer. And then that passion for light began. And then I started to, I was a designer before I was a photographer. So 20 years as a graphic designer, commissioning other photographers. But all that time, I was still making films. In those days, I was making adventure films and shooting still. So I was in the Arctic. I was amongst polar bears, climbing mountains, hanging out of helicopters. Sometimes I occasionally still do that kind of stuff, which I love and adore. But that passion for light was sort of born within me, or that spark ignited way back when I was 9 years old, which is actually about the same time that I started being aware of photography. And I remember watching a documentary. I would have been certainly primary school, and it was Sir Don McCullum, and he flipped the back open of his Nikon, I think it was, and popped film and shut it, and off he went. And I was so amazed by how automatically he did that. And also those days, that style of documentary filmmaking was so run and gun, handheld, and I love that. So I became aware of Don McCullum very early, and amazingly, and there are many amazing things have happened to me in my career, but I've worked with Don many times, and in fact, just under 10 years ago, I made a documentary about him in Kolkata with Canon, and a short documentary, and it just a joy to work with him. I've worked with him on several campaign shoots as well. So, and just to go back to lighting, if you work with people like, and I've been very lucky, so I work with Don a lot. So Don is one of these people where you can be chatting with him, and he'll suddenly stop and he'll say, "Clive, look at the light." And so you become a light obsessive. And I think this is really important. This is what I try to tell young people, or explain to young people. I was teaching just last week in Edinburgh for the Canon Young People program. And I explain, and I have slides and a keynote about this sort of influence of light coming from great painters. I'm always interested. And it's interesting that young people, when I do a lighting workshop, I do a very simple lighting workshop with a 2x1 LED, a reflector, a diffuser, and very occasionally another light. And I put a picture up on the screen. There's one or two pictures I've got which are the full sort of three-dimensional light. There's one of Carlos Acosta, the dancer, and I've got another one of Terence Stamp, and one or two others. And I say, right, match that lighting, guys. And so they get one of them to stand, and then the others match it. And on that one, we will sometimes tether that to a big screen, and they can see what they're doing. But you know what's interesting about working with young people? I've done this workshop for 8-year-olds, right? It was in a primary school in West Cumbria. I think it was still at primary school, and I got a message on Facebook from one of the children's mother, who said, I can't remember the child's name now. I think it was Delia, and she'd come home and she was talking about Rembrandt Triangle. She was talking about Vermeer. She was talking about Caravaggio. She was talking about half light. She was telling her mum all about these different ways that she can light. And of course, it's interesting to young people, because what do young people do? They're taking selfies. And if you can empower young people with some knowledge about light, half light, diffused light, um, light to make them scary, light to make you menacing, complementary light, flattering light, harsh light, and of course that then helps them to tell their own stories through their smartphones. So this obsession with light it's been carried all through my life, and then I started to work with fashion photographer Nick Knight, who actually he was responsible for launching my career as a photographer, which is another story. I shot some pictures at a party with just one camera and one lens in available light way back 20 years ago now. And Nick saw these, and at the time nobody was doing that. It was with an 85 prime, and I was shooting wide open, and the light was so incredible, because these were very, very lavish parties for people like Louis Vuitton, and all sorts of amazing brands. Moet and Chandon was the brand I worked with back then. Nick saw this work and then immediately commissioned me to become his set photographer, and then I worked with him with Show Studio, and still do work with Nick and talk with Nick. So Nick also, I learned a lot going on the set of people like Nick Knight, who is, there's no two ways about it, arguably one of the best photographers this country has ever seen. Probably still is the most prominent and incredible fashion photographer. I also worked with Miles Aldrich, a master of flash photography. So I've been influenced by so many people. But I could keep telling you these influences. I guess the one that, from a film perspective, you want to talk about cinematic lighting, one of the biggest influences I had was watching the film Barry Lyndon, which is a Stanley Kubrick movie, a really underrated Stanley Kubrick movie. And he wanted to shoot these scenes in candlelight, and this was in around 1974, and of course the technology wasn't available, but, and this is quite pertinent given that we're now going back to the moon, NASA had commissioned Carl Zeiss to make several lenses to photograph the far side of the moon, and the Artemis mission just recently has actually done just that. But back then, that was very hard to do. So Zeiss made these 0.7 aperture lenses to photograph the far side of the moon. Really, from satellites, researching the far side of the moon before the Apollo space program and before they put human beings on the moon. So Kubrick found out about these lenses. He bought several of them. I can't remember exactly how many. And then got his team to connect these lenses to a Mitchell's camera. And he was then able, through various means, to film is cast in incredibly low light. I understand they might have used triple wick candles, which burn very quickly. And of course, the depth of field was so shallow, but amazing bokeh. And that film, when I first saw that film, I remember that, wow, and that film for me was a big influence. So whilst I'm a massive lover of light, there is one other element, and again, that's a pun, an intended pun, because it's the fact that I look at cinematic lighting, but I also use prime lenses, and I only use prime lenses. It's rare I'll ever use a zoom. In fact, right now I'm talking to you through one of the new 35 millimeter hybrid lenses from Canon, and I think it's at 1.4. And so I built a career from shooting on the 85 prime, predominantly at 1.2, because if you can get really beautiful lighting and then you can combine that with a very shallow depth of field and this incredible bokeh, however you want to pronounce it, you get something very special. And that's what Nick saw in my early work, and then he commissioned me to do that. And in fact, right up to this day, right up to right now, my latest project with Birmingham Royal Ballet, I'm still shooting and lighting in that very same way.
It's funny you mentioned the 85 1.2. I literally 2 days ago I replaced my old 85 and I bought an 85 1.2, and it's unreal. I mean, it's unbelievable. So yeah,
So are you a Canon user? I don't know. It's like,
I should
okay,
Nikon.
don't need that. It's listen. I'm a Canon ambassador. It doesn't matter to me.
No,
At our events, every camera. It's the love of photography
yeah.
and storytelling.
And
Or filmmaking.
Yeah, and the truth is, I've shot many camera brands. In fact, I shot on the Canon cinema line, for a long time. So
yeah.
it's I have various Canon film cameras up above me, which you can't see it as I shot. But
Yeah.
it's the only reason, and this is absolutely true. The only reason why when I went into professional photography, I ended up with Nikon was because my dad used to shoot Nikon, and it was just it's just how it worked, basically.
I think. Well, I mean, look, one of the best ways to market in the world is through word of mouth. Like, we all know that, don't we? And also through somebody recommending something to you, and and in actual fact, Nikon is still with the space program as well. Even we were just talking about that a moment ago, and I think the latest pictures of the moon were shot on the Z5 and Z9. I don't know much about Nikon, but yeah, the 85, the original Canon EF 85 prime was like, from the moment I decided to become a photographer, because bear in mind, 20 years ago, I was a graphic designer and I was commissioning photographers. The moment I decided I wanted to be a photographer, I had two goals. One was full frame digital. So the moment the 5D came out, I got it. And then the next big goal was the 85 prime. And for many years, that's all I used. And this is absolutely true, that I literally built a career through that lens, and what I shot on that lens in available light. And there are many times, even studio shoots, where my assistants are all Capture One and mostly Phase One or Hasselblad, and I'd pitch up, with my 1DS Mark III, or later on, whatever it was, and my 85 prime, and sometimes they'd actually get up from their sort of chair from the ISO, come over and look at the camera and say, are you sure this is a 35mm camera? Because the lens was that good, the optics were that good, and of course now with the RF lenses, that they're off the chart. They're just incredible.
Absolutely. I mean, I have a similar story. Like I built a career on a Nikon D750, which at the time was a really good camera, but it was sort of kind of regarded as like a serious enthusiast camera rather than a professional camera, in inverted commas. But when I first started on photography, that's all I could afford, and it was by a long shot the best camera I ever shot with at the time. It was full frame, and I got hold of some really good secondhand glass and things. And I built my whole career on that. It was the same experience. I would rock up to a shoot in a studio, and everybody was like, I'm like really expensive like cameras, and I rock up with my little D750. They're like, "What is this?" I'm like, "I don't know, works for me." Hey, let me just jump in real quick to tell you about the amazing sponsor of this episode, Platypod. Platypod offers innovative camera support systems designed to unleash your creativity. With their stable, versatile, and portable solutions, you can capture stunning shots like never before. And I'm not just saying that. As the host of the Camera Shake podcast, I can personally vouch for Platypod's incredible products. They've become an integral part of the show. In fact, I'm surrounded by various Platypod products holding up lights, cameras, microphones, and so on. It's really helped to transform the way I make the show and the way I shoot at home, in the studio, and on location. But don't just take my word for it. Explore Platypod's website at www.platypod.com to discover their range of products, including the Platypod Extreme, Platypod tripod heads, and the brand new handle, of course. Make sure to follow Platypod on Instagram and Facebook at Platypod Tripods for exclusive updates, tips, and giveaways. By choosing Platypod, you're not only investing in your photography, but you're also supporting the Camera Shake Photography Podcast. Thanks again to Platypod, our amazing sponsor. Platypod, where innovation never sleeps.
But it was a full frame, right? That was a full frame, right? Yeah, that was. I think that was the key, wasn't it? Combine that glass with the full frame,
Exactly.
and you've got magic. You've literally got magic, because most of the time back then, when I was doing that, most of the time, I mean, it was in effect, it was event photography, but it was like very, very classy parties, and I would be in a dinner jacket, and Moet and Shannon would give me this AAA pass for all the events I went to, and I could just walk around wherever I wanted to go. And a lot of the times you'd be with A-list actors, or you'd be with fashion models, and I think if I had that opportunity now, I'd do so much more with it, because at the time I felt really intimidated and very nervous. But at the same time, I was like with the 85 gives you that little bit of distance. I don't know whether you find that yourself.
Yeah.
It sort of pushes you back a bit.
Yeah.
And you can be you can almost go incognito. And I always used to say, it's like shooting around corners. You can shoot through gaps, shoot around corners. And, I used to use the selective focus. So I'd pin in those days, you had 16 little squares. It was 12 or 16 little squares. And I think, and I was shooting in such low light, that for every frame I'd shoot, I'd probably shoot, I don't know, 20, 30. Of course, now with the RF system and the R5 Mark II, literally with face recognition, etc., eye recognition, literally every time you press the button, it nails it. But back then it didn't. And I think the fact is, most people use flash, they use zoom lenses. And so I came along with this 85 prime and full frame sensor on the R5. And do you know what's interesting? That camera was a 13 megapixel camera, right? But the files from it are just extraordinarily beautiful. And I still have those files now. And of course, thanks to modern technology, some of the algorithms built into Adobe, I can slightly up-res those files, and I can get spectacularly beautiful fine art prints from those files from all those years ago.
Yeah, I think the that megapixel debate is very much overblown. I mean, I remember I used to shoot billboard campaigns with 6 megapixels. They were fun.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
I remember not too long ago, I actually shot a billboard thing with a 24 megapixel camera, and I got a lot of grief. And I was like, how, what? You're not shooting it on a like 45 or 50 or?
I know.
No, because how far?
I used to get this issue. Yeah.
Yeah.
Particularly if you shoot an ad agency, the agency would say, well, it's got to be a 48 shoot or whatever it is, and what you're not shooting phase one, you're not shooting Hasselblad, you're not shooting this, you're not shooting that. So no, I'm going to be shooting. I remember 10 years ago, Canon brought out 5DS and 5DSR, and that was a big megapixel camera at the time, and I did shoot a lot with that, and I actually shot campaign work with that, and but you had to nail your exposure, unlike now where I have a camera that's got huge dynamic range, so you can pull the shadows out, you can pull the highlights out. Back then you couldn't. But there's so many advantages to shooting with a 35 mil over other sort of formats, and I agree with you. Like, where are you going to max out? I think the only way you'll max out with, say, a big sensor is very large fine art archival prints, and I for one would love to see that, because I'm a print obsessive, and a lot of the work that I've been doing over the last 3 years now is about fine art archival print, shooting for fine art archival print. I guess we can talk about a little bit more about that later.
What's the biggest misconception that people usually have about cinematic lighting in particular?
I think people overcomplicate things personally. I mean, I've been filmed right here, right in my studio here, and I have had. I'm not a big fan of being the other side of the camera, but if I can control the light like this, like I am doing here, I'm kind of cool with it. Um, but I had a crew in a while back, and the DOP came in, and it was lit like this. And I kind of assumed that they would probably, I could just move the lights around a little bit, sort of flip it, so I could continue to be lit like this. But I think the guy brought in gosh, it felt like an enormous, like softbox, gigantic. Again, a softbox, it's great, the grid, but when it was on, it literally filled this entire space with light, and it just flattened the light completely. And there was no shape in the light. And for me, light is shape. Um, Light, shape, lens, atmosphere, um, and all it basically it stripped away all of the atmosphere from. It also showed all the dust. Because I live in a house that is where I'm sitting now is built in 1667, so you can see some of the. I'm in the eaves of the house. You can see some of that. So yeah, that was a bit worrying when everybody saw how dusty it was. Even me, because I don't normally I'm in this sort of lovely soft, 3-dimensional light. So I think there's this tendency that I see where people kind of, how can I say it? Play it safe a little bit. Would that sound fair? Um, I I'm a big believer that I go way back to when I was influenced, at the age of 9, and then I started to, become a light obsessive. Looked at the work of painters, then started to look at the work of course, photographers and filmmakers in particular. Um, and you know, atmosphere comes from light. So much of the atmosphere comes from light. And the minute you put a big flat, soft light and everything, you'll kill the atmosphere. So you might say you paint with light. And so, for example, in here, I built this broadcast studio, and there's multi cameras, and I've got rostrum cameras, and I give, in fact, I give workshops from right here. And so I thought, well, if I'm going to do that, I'm going to have to create a blackout. So I blacked out. I've got a big Velux window here, but I had that blacked out. So it's got a blackout blind. So the moment I could black out a space, I can then control the light. I can then bring in different lights, different temperatures, etc. So finding that way of controlling light is important. And if you're working on location, of course, you can soften light with diffusers. You can bounce light, whether it be with a white reflector, with a silver or gold reflector. And I've done that in fashion, and I've done that with um, you know movie stars and stuff like that, and it works to great effect. But I remember one time, particularly, sounds like I'm name dropping. I was in Cannes, and I was shooting in a big villa there. And I've done a few shoots there. I remember spending a weekend one time. I was photographing Karen Gillan, and it was before she went to Hollywood, and it just got these extraordinary pictures with her. But they the pictures, it was tough, because it was like I only knew I was going like the day before, and then the next minute I'm on a plane to Nice, and then all of a sudden I'm in this villa, and but the best pictures were when we sort of cut loose, and she's, if you've seen Karen in sort of interviews and at work, she's this amazing sort of vibrant human being, and very creative, not just an actor but a director, previously a model, writer, etc. And so it became a collaboration. And I remember us literally running down the street in Cannes, and I was chasing and trying to shoot, and she was jumping on carousels, and I was just like photographing it, and the freedom that we had was extraordinary. But we stopped for a break, and I remember looking. I sort of sat in a chair by the street side. And, when you're in a location like that, you're looking at the location, because if you're going to shoot a portrait of somebody, you might want to create a narrative. And so I looked at the location. This cafe was quite famous. Can't remember the exact one, but I noticed there was a table, and the people were walking past, And I suddenly thought, "Oh, crikey, if I can get a chair in there." So I got the owner to bring a chair, and I was just playing around with my camera. I think I put out, I can't remember, 35, 24 mm lens on whatever, primes again. And I asked her to go and sit in this chair, and I got this extraordinary portrait of her. And it was a moment of collaboration between her and I, but she sat in the most incredible demure pose. It was really moving, actually. Um, and then there was another moment where we were in the villa, and she brought this Jonathan Saunders outfit, Scottish designer who I work with, and she brought her own wardrobe from Glasgow. I think she's flown in from to Nice, and not much of it, but she got these beautiful, I think, the Louboutin shoes, and you're in this situation where you don't know what you're going to do. There was no pre-planning or anything, and so you're drawing on your sort of 20 years as an art director, as a graphic designer, and working in print and shooting for print, but when you're working with someone like that, you have, it's about collaboration. So I said, well, why don't you stand on the diving board and I'll shoot from this side of the pool, and there was this wonderful moment where she lay on the diving board, and I was actually on water side, and I think I was shooting on another favorite lens back then, a 135, a Canon EF 135. Beautiful lens, incredibly sharp. And she reached down and touched the water. At the same time, she kicks her feet up so you can see her heels, and you can see the ginger hair. And what was so poignant about that for me was, although you couldn't quite see it was Canon, it was glamorous. There was this lovely balustrade in Lord's fence, and it was like she was reaching down, almost peering into her future. And that one weekend gave me such a huge amount of work. And then I went back to Cannes a few years later with David Koss and Freya Maver. That there was a new movie coming out, and this is for the British Film Company, and a producer friend of mine now. And invited me to go back. And I remember we'd done the same thing. We'd gone down the beach and I'd done that stuff, but not quite so easy with two. And then we're in the chateau. There's an incredible, well, villa, I guess. It's like on 4 or 5 floors, and it's just full of these amazing paintings, and they're gigantic. And I hadn't really thought about them previously. And then I started to look at the signature, and they were all Salvador Dali originals.
Wow.
I think the Dali, there's a huge Dali collection, probably worth more than the villa itself. And I then get my app out, Sunseeker app, and I start to look at where the sun's going to be at what time, and then I'd clock in the light all day long. I'm looking at it, and I noticed at a certain time of day, I was there for a few days, so I noticed at a certain time of day, you get this beautiful window light, and it would come across the paintings. And I thought, if I could put the two of them, one on the sofa and one standing looking at the camera, I'll get a really cinematic, beautiful shot. And that's exactly what I did. And so often, even though you're put in situations and you have to work really quickly, you kind of draw on that sort of bank of knowledge that you build over many, many years. And the only way you build that, as I know you will know this, Kirsten, is just by doing. By doing and experimenting and trying, and most of all, making mistakes. Most of all. And they're not mistakes, they're learnings. I guess my favourite story about light would be the late actor, and he died, I think it was last year, Terence Stamp, who I met in a tea shop. And I sort of engaged him in a conversation. It's quite a funny story. It's a long story, so people can look it up. I thought I made a fool of myself. He came over, said goodbye, and then I chased him down Berwick Street. I was so eager to photograph him. I had no camera, and I mentioned that my agent, Mark George, used to represent Terence Donovan, Burt Stern, Richard Avedon, and still Sir Don McCullum. And he's just sort of lit up at the mention of Terence Donovan, because Donovan took this beautiful picture of him on a movie Far From the Madding Crowd, and he said, "Well, meet me here tomorrow." So I met him in the same tea shop the next day. And again, even though I didn't have much time, when he'd headed off into the sunset, I went back to the tea shop, got my app out, looked at all the lighting directions, looked at the weather, because I found out the next day it wasn't going to be direct sun. It was going to be soft cloud. So it was going to be a soft light through the window. Booked the 2 tables with the guys, with the owners, said, does Terence Stamp come in here every day or all the time? He said, yeah, all the time. I said, what's his favourite tea? They told me. Next day, before 11, I made sure his favourite tea was on the table. And sure enough, he walked in. And I got this extraordinary picture of him sipping a cup of tea. But, we talked for 40 minutes before I took a single picture. And this is another big part of the story, is how you, that space between you and the lens, between you and the subject, the lens and the subject, like this space here, and the interpersonal skills that you need with a subject. Because some people, for me mostly, I've had good experiences, but I know sometimes it can be very difficult. But developing those interpersonal skills are really, really important. And then I went off with Stamp I managed to persuade him to go to a friend of mine's place, a film director, and I'd photographed her for a portrait. She was up for a BAFTA, and she lived near Ronnie Scott's on Frith Street, and she got this beautiful old leather chair and a Victorian sort of screen and shuttered windows. And I said to him, how do you fancy, being photographed there? And he just shrugged. And then we left that location. And all the way he's telling me about movie projects, about working with Zeffirelli, Soderbergh. I mean, this guy's a legend from the 60s. He was talking about his, growing up and beginning his career with Michael Caine and Sean Connery and Roger Moore, all of that. Anyway, we got him into this location, and then I took probably, I think, the most extraordinary set of portraits I've ever taken. And it was really about the light, because I could completely control the light. I bought these shutters too, so it was just a slit of light. And then I think Jackie, who I was there, who I'd photographed previously, whose house it was, her son, I think Oliver, held the reflector and bounced a bit of light in. That was on the 1DX, and that was the first time I'd shot at 3200 ISO. And this would have been, I think, 2011-12. And I shot that on the 50mm, and I think it was mostly on the 50 actually, and the 85 primes, EF primes. But I'm immensely proud of those 3 stories, and how if you just work very, stop and think, and just and yes, take risks, but building that personal relationship. So I'd had plenty of time with Stamp to talk to him and get to know him, and I think he realized that I wasn't messing around. I was looking to get really good pictures of him.
I think what's really interesting about this is that I think one of the misconceptions for a lot of people is that in order to create cinematic lighting, you have to have all of this gear, you have to have these modifiers and these lights and stuff like that. When it sounds to me like the truth really is you need to really just be able to read light in the first instance and recognize opportunity when it comes to lighting. And you're talking about using an app to figure out where the light is going to be, checking the weather, and applying that to the location that you're in. That sense of pre-planning and awareness of how this location will interact with the light, I think that seems to be, it's like the key factor, rather than having a room full of expensive, I don't know, pro photo, whatever, insert any other.
Well, Ari, I mean, I remember shooting a perfume commercial. It would be 15 years ago, and I was cinematographer, working with a wonderful director, Charlotte Leroux, and in fact, I met Charlotte backstage in the Raphael Gallery at the V&A, Victoria and Albert Museum, and there was an event called Fashion in Motion, and I'd got the very first 5D Mark II in the country. And Canon, this is, when's this, 2008, and Canon, I'd pitched this idea, and Canon had sort of said, okay, we like that idea. And Vincent Laforet at the time had made this film with the R5 Mark II in America, and at that time, it's kind of hard, for people to understand now. But back then, I don't know if you remember, But back then, to achieve the kind of results that, say, Stanley Kubrick was achieving back in 1974, you needed to spend like 100K or 150K, and then Canon came along with a 5D Mark II that could shoot, through primes in HD at 30 frames a second, and all of a sudden, you've got these stills that I'd been shooting were moving, and so I shot this short film for Roxandra Lynchich, and I'm still proud of that film now. It's only I worked with a guy in New York at the time with Mac Cosmetics, because a lot of people saw this work. It was like my initial work with Nick Knight, and then I got this the very first 5D Mark II, shot this sort of film, and then all of a sudden, all the clients I've been working with would commission me to shoot moving image, and Charlotte was one of them. And I remember that when I got I got my MacBook and I got Lightroom open and brought the files in, and I was backstage, and all the models were there and everybody was there. I'll tell you how early it was. When you put the camera up, a DSLR is what it was in those days. When you brought the camera up to a model, the model, you'd be holding on it because you were filming, and they didn't know that you were filming, because back then, a DSLR was a stills camera, not a film camera. And there was a huge crowd around my laptop saying, "What's this? How are you doing this?" And that led to enormous amounts of work, and that then built my sort of moving image career on the back of that. But that then led to me working in commercials, and then I did this project going back to light. By the way, that light I would just pop arits in I forget what they were, 0.5s, I think. So I've got tungsten. I used to work with tungsten, beautiful tungsten light back in the Raphael Gallery, and got these sensational pictures. I mean, just extraordinary. And then the film in it as well. Just me and an assistant, just two of us doing all of that. But when we did the perfume commercial, we did the first one in Paris, which was with the Paris Ballet, which was really beautiful. But then we did this one in Oxford, and it was in an old house. And I remember we did 2 location finds at the time, and it was quite an ambitious shoot. It's a very expensive perfume, and so I have 3, 4 assistants on that, all absolutely brilliant lighting assistants, photographers in their own right, brought up assisting some of the country's greatest lighting photographers, and so they taught me how to light. So I literally had a lorry, a small lorry full of Arri lights, but I'd done so much homework on where the light would be in the location, in each room, that I literally shot the entire commercial in natural light, the whole thing. And sometimes the light would only be there for minutes. And there was one dolly shot I remember particularly where the model was in this beautiful Alexander McQueen dress, and I literally only had the light for minutes, and that was the 85 prime again. So I went from using my primes in stills into using the primes in moving image and for commercials. But yeah, I had a big truck full of Arri lighting, and I think we used one light, and that was for my editor who I had along with me on the shoot. He would take the rushes, and then we'd have a quick look at everything, and I used it to light his desk. But the rest of it was all lit naturally. And then we had haze machines, and we would diffuse the windows and stuff like that. But fortunately, again, we had an overcast day. But what was interesting was we've literally followed the light around the property. And so as the light moved around, we moved around. Again, another it's interesting when I look back, I sometimes forget about these things, but every time you do one of these projects, you learn something. I think the hardest thing for a lot of people back then or now would be to leave the stuff in the truck, and be bold enough to say, no, I'm going to go with available light. and just I'm not gonna, because the minute you stop pulling those lights out, you're getting into a whole world of sort of setup. We didn't have time. There wasn't the
Yeah.
budget for it. Well, I think we had a 2-day shoot.
And that's the thing
So,
sometimes.
and I think, yeah,
It's this ability to pre-plan. I think, I did a shoot, only a few weeks ago, in Ireland at the Dark Hedges, and it was like, it's an Irish wedding scene, and the we knew that the sun was gonna come up at a very specific time over a hill, and it would light the scene in a very specific way, and we're waiting for that golden light, but we also knew we only had about 3 minutes to shoot that because, and also there was luck involved because it was going to be an overcast day, but we knew we had this window at exactly that time, and it was a similar sort of situation. We had to be there at that time to be ready, and we're just waiting for it. And literally, the sun just peeked over the mountain, over the crest, and it lit the scene. And we literally had 3 minutes to shoot that, and then it was gone. And then the clouds moved in, and that was it.
yeah,
That was that took quite a bit of pre-planning to make sure everything was ready, everything was in position, the models were in position, everything was ready, and then 3 minutes and it was gone. It's cold as heck as well. That was the other thing.
yeah. Yeah, but I love hearing stories like that because you can't replicate that.
No.
No matter how much you try, you can't replicate that. I mean, and I mean, a lot of movies now are shot in digital volumes. In fact, a friend of mine runs one of the biggest digital volumes in London, and they are amazing. I mean, they're incredible. I'm very keen to work with one, but of course, a lot of location stuff now is going to the digital volume. But there's still something about location that is great. And I do love shooting location. And in fact, I've got a shoot coming up, which I'm excited about, which involves ballet and location. And I'll probably be using Flash in the first time for many years. So that's going to be interesting.
Yeah.
Uh,
So tell me a little bit
but
about that project, because you mentioned working with the Birmingham Ballet. So tell me a little
mm.
bit about that project.
Well, this is a project that came on the back of the VR film. So I'd noticed first of all, I've been working with the Birmingham Royal Ballet now for almost 10 years. And it actually began at the photography show where I got chatting with the guy after I was given, it was actually when I'd made the documentary about Saddam McCullen in Calcutta. I was giving a talk about that. And this guy came up to me at the end and we were chatting. And I asked him what he did. He was obviously a keen photographer, but and he had a very interesting poise, and you can always tell when you're talking to. I now can tell when I'm talking to an elite dancer, but he was a dancer and an elite dancer at that, and a principal at Birmingham Royal Ballet, Tyrone Singleton, and a very good photographer. And he and I became friends, and through Ty, it sort of reintroduced me back into ballet because I'd worked in ballet, shooting commercial for Paris Ballet, for perfume commercials and stuff in London, and I became immediately fascinated by ballet, particularly by what it takes to be an elite dancer. So the sacrifices that these people make. Many begin at the age of 4. They go to ballet school, and you only have to look at an elite dancer's body to see the huge level of sacrifice and dedication it takes to do what they do. Live in pain a lot of the time. So I did. We did. In fact, we did the first shoot with the cinema. Sorry, not cinema. We did the first shoot with our system, and incredibly big, high security shoot in London because when Canon launched the EOS R system, it was a big step change, for the brand, the biggest in 30 years. So I did the world's first studio shoot, and that was with ballet, and so this relationship started to build, and I'm very proud of the work that we did on that. And there's a lovely behind the scenes film of that too, which is still on, I think, the Canon website from 2019, I think. And then as I went into the VR film, we were was filming, we were doing some test shots, and I was sort of recreating this sort of, and again, to reference another painter, Degas, this sort of Degas sort of lighting with ballerinas. And I noticed that in Swan Lake, you've got something called the Cygnets, these 4 ballerinas, and they make what they do look effortless. And of course, that's what a dancer does. You know, their goal in life is to make what they do look effortless, like they defy gravity. And of course, they did that. And I kept the camera rolling. This is the VR film. So the sound finished, and they're still sort of coming down off this sort of performance, and they're really out of breath and they're perspiring. And then I started to think back to all the times I've been side stage and realized just how breathless dancers are. And I mean, more recently, I was working side stage on Carlos Acosta's Don Quixote, and gosh, some of the performances there, I mean, the dancers really have to work hard, and they're literally panting as they come off stage, and perspiring. And so I had this idea that wouldn't it be interesting to photograph dancers in the first few seconds as they come off stage, and sort of get this perspiration, get this sort of this. Sometimes they've got anger, sometimes it's relief. Sometimes they can be in tears. So there's this whole emotional journey they go on as well. And so I wrote a film treatment, and I can share that with you. I wrote a film treatment, and as I do for all my projects, and explained exactly what I wanted to do. I wanted to shoot the dancers side stage just as they come off stage. And I pitched that to Tom Rogers at Birmingham Royal Ballet, he's the creative content producer, and it pretty much got a no straight away, in a nice way, because Tom and I had made the VR film, and the great thing I've got with Birmingham Royal Ballet is that we're not answerable to anybody other than ourselves. So it's the most beautiful, pure, creative relationship I've ever had. So it's really just myself and Tom. Sometimes my agent Mark or producer Mark helps too with edit and production. And so Tom said, no, look, we can't do it because you can't have light side stage, because it could actually spill into the stage. So, and I was trying to explain, well, we could point away from the stage. It could be like 4%, and the camera shoots low light. So anyway, it went from a no, and then I thought, okay, that's not going to happen. But, I've had a go. And then a few weeks later, I get a phone call from Tom saying, have you got that PDF of that shoot treatment? And I said, yeah, sure. He said, can you get it to me immediately? So I sent it to him, and I said, what's it for? He said, I can't tell you. And then I think that was on a Wednesday, and then on a Friday, he phones me up and says, do you want some good news? And I said, yeah, always. He said, right, we're going to Japan next year. We're going to World Expo, and I've got the go-ahead to shoot the portraits of the dancers side stage and backstage. And it was like, wow, okay. And he then explained to me that where this idea began, and there's a film to back all this up, and this is my most recent one, and where this all began was that Birmingham Royal Ballet are doing this world-first medical research into something called relative energy deficiency in dance. And it's where dancers have to work incredibly hard. They might do 30, almost 40 performances, over weeks, over 3 weeks. And, dancers' body shape can actually change, over 3 weeks, from when they begin to the middle to the end. And if a dancer can't replenish the energy that they're expending, it can actually have in some cases, pretty severe consequences. Worst case scenario is early onset osteoporosis. So this research, which is being conducted by BRB's clinical director, Dr. Nick Allen, is world first. And so the Department for Culture, Media and Sport, Department for Business and Trade, the Arts Council that approached Birmingham Royal Ballet said, we're at World Expo, it's World Health Week, you're in Tokyo, could you perform for us? Have you got anything else we can do? And so then BRB put this package together and said, well, if Clive shoots these portraits, we can actually have an exhibition of the portraiture as well as highlight the medical research. And one of the things that in my career in the last 10 years, and this kind of happened. It was very I remember 2013, I decided I wanted to do meaningful work. And it wasn't that I wasn't doing it necessarily. I was enjoying what I was doing. But by then I was doing some big advertising shoots and I was directing, and there was 50 people on set all hanging on your every word. And of course the world's changed since then. Um, but I wanted to sort of go back to the purity of one camera, and so I did this project in Scotland, and and this project then turned into working with the Royal National Lifeboat Institution, and then talking about volunteers. So it was about legacy and looking for meaningful work, and so I'm always on the lookout for that. And this, in my work with Birmingham Royal Ballet, the VR film for neurodiverse young people and adults, really important, really meaningful. So this project just fitted perfectly. We could raise awareness to this world first research, and actually the research will have far-reaching implications for osteoporosis research, both nationally and globally. So it's a very, very important project. And so what I've been doing for the last 3 years is literally photographing dancers. We're now on we've just shot our 5th production. Photographing dancers just as they come off stage, sometimes before, sometimes during, and sometimes after. And we've had tears, we've had pain, relief, excitement, the whole gamut of things. And it is so simple, it's untrue. It's this light, or now a new one, but similar to this, 2x1 LED softbox and grid, an R5 Mark II, and for the most part, a 50mm prime lens, and often shooting very wide open. And that's it, Kirsten. That's what I'm producing this huge body of work. It went to World Expo. We had a major exhibition. Canon have sort of embraced it because it's all about fine archival printmaking. Hahnemuller Paper have also embraced it, as have ISO monitors, and now Godox are helping me too. So I think when you can find something that is unique, and you can, it's taken me 10 years to get to this point, and then you've got this incredible access, and then, I mean, just to work with these guys, these dancers, the costumes, everything about it, it's just extraordinary, and it's such a joy to work on.
It's interesting because you've mentioned the filmmaking aspect of it, for example, early on. Do you think that, and this ties in with last week's episode, in fact, where we're talking about the importance of video for modern photographers in the world that we live in terms of promotion, advertising, social media, but also in terms of client expectations, for example. Um,
Mm.
do you think? And I know a lot of photographers who might listen to this might think, oh, but like I'm strictly a stills photographer, and there may still be sometimes this mental barrier between stills photography and video or film. But do you think that your thinking as a filmmaker has, first of all, influenced the way that you look at light in a stills image? Has that played an important role?
Yeah, definitely. I think there's interesting to, when you're asked to shoot, and I can go back 15 years now, being asked to shoot commercial and shoot the campaign at the same time. I think, for me anyway, I can't speak for other people. When I'm shooting stills, I go into this sort of stills mindset, because when I'm shooting stills, I'm shooting for print mostly. So that changes the way I think as well, because I think very carefully about the camera settings, ISO settings, making sure everything's, shutter speed, there's going to be no camera shake. I'm going to extract the maximum amount of data out of the camera. And then when you're asked to shoot moving image at the same time, for me anyway, they're two very different disciplines. And I think it's incredibly difficult to switch from one to the other like that. Of course, now, we can actually extract well, we could a while back, but you can actually extract pretty good stills from moving image. So, but then you've got the issue of, is it 16:9 or 9:16? So you've got the additional challenges now. But the projects that I'm talking about, even 3 years ago when we're doing VR, obviously VR is VR. It's a new medium really to be shooting in, to do narrative storytelling in. So very difficult to switch, or maybe less difficult to switch from that to stills. But when you're shooting a commercial, say, or a short film or a documentary, and then to be asked to shoot the stills as well, I personally find that very difficult because I'm in one discipline or the other discipline. So I'm in this moving image discipline or I'm in the stills discipline. And I really respect anybody who can like switch between the two. But you have to remember that, some of the projects that I'm talking about, I'm given proper budgets, given time to prepare, I'm given time to do, to edit, to grade, to post-produce. Whereas I think now what you're looking at is, when and let's be clear, this is content creation now, as opposed to, back then it would be seen less as content creation and more as campaign work, I guess, that would have, sometimes that campaign work may have several weeks, if not months, whereas now, I don't know what the average age of content is, but it's probably measured in days rather than months. So I think there's over every year, right? Over 2 trillion pictures are taken. Over 2 trillion. That's almost impossible for a human being to sort of imagine. If you were to count 2 trillion back in seconds, it would take you to prehistoric times. So that kind of puts it in perspective. So, and as a result, I think, to a degree, photography has been devalued. I mean, I don't think there's any getting away from that. And so how do you stay relevant as a photographer? And this is one of the biggest challenges, I think, that we have right now. And I think one of the ways is to be able to shoot, well, you've not just got to shoot moving image, you've not just got to shoot stills, you might have to shoot 16:9, you might have to shoot 9:16, and you've got to do it in what appears to me like you've got to do it in a day, or in several days, or several different jobs in several days. So, I came from a time where you had, and it wasn't a luxury, you still had very little time, but there were bigger budgets and you had more time to prepare. And, you'd have sometimes you'd have weeks in the edit and grade. Whereas now the demand is for photographers to shoot video, to shoot stills, to deliver it, almost immediately. And, I think another concern I have also is that, by doing that, does that die? Yes, there are going to be some people who are going to look out and they're going to get great content and great work, but it doesn't necessarily give you the time to think and prepare, like we were talking about earlier, and really craft stuff. So I feel like the word craft is probably, it's very hard to do something that involves craft when you're pushed to do it in a, there's always that risk it's going to go wrong. And for me, that would break my heart if I was to ever produce something and deliver something that didn't fit a set of standards that I have in my own head, which is why I've kind of gone back to print, because print is craft. Fine archival printmaking is all about craft. It's the prints that I make here from my raw files that go through Lightroom and my ISO, those prints are archival for 200 years. That would be 8 generations, or it could be, for example, someone's great grandchild might have that picture still on their wall in 200 years' time. So I'm a big advocate for craft. And I actually believe that, many people feel that way. I mean, look at the interest in analog photography, look at the interest in CDs and tapes, vinyl. And I think with fine archival printmaking, even though it's a digital darkroom, it is still very much a craft. So I'm a big believer in the craft of filmmaking. I'm a big believer in the craft of photography and of print. But I think unrealistic expectations are set for many people now with big brands. And of course, the big brand model now, it seems from what I'm reading, is that rather than spending a lot of money on campaigns, it's split across content creation in the many different areas. And of course, those content creators have huge followings, and then that's how you reach that market. So that the whole model seems to have changed now. I don't know how you found it.
It's I find that client expectations have definitely shifted, and I think I had a really interesting discussion with an editor actually about this not too long ago, and so I find this very often in just your average kind of commercial type of shoot. The expectation now is that there's not only stills, but there's also a video component and everything, and the social media component. Then the delivery times are virtually almost 0 days. Like you shoot the first day, but then the next morning they already want a video that plays on the screens, and and it's like, and the interesting thing about that is it's sort of I see it almost like a never-ending circle, or like a catch-22, because you have on one hand, you have technology companies, creating technologies, like camera companies making cameras that are amazing stills, but also amazing video cameras at the same time. The R5 is one example. In the Nikon world, the Z8 or the Z9 are another example. So now you have all of that weaponry, so to say, in one tool. Now the client has an iPhone that both creates stills and video. And so because they're using that in their everyday life, whether it's to film their dog or their family or whatever, they automatically have the expectation that if they can do it on their phone, you as a professional must be able to do that, but better.
Yep.
And I can totally see how a lot of photographers look at that baseline client expectation that seems to be emerging now and go like, whoa, this is like, now I have to know about not only video, but I also have to know about video editing and grading and all these different things. And I can see how that can be super overwhelming. Maybe not if you're 22 years old and you've grown up like that. But once you get to my age,
I mean, yeah, and me too. And I mean, interestingly, when COVID came 6 years ago, pre-COVID, I'd worked with I've got a wonderful editor in London, Tristram, who is incredibly talented, and I've been very lucky to work with some amazing colorists, features colorists, and working with great digitech people and movies people, really. So that had a big influence upon me and on the craft of filmmaking. But COVID came along, and all of a sudden, I had no access to anybody. I was here, and it's kind of like, what do you do? The jobs just stopped; they were pulled immediately.
Yeah, same.
Yeah, and of course, it was putting aside the horror of COVID, because it's easy to forget. 6 years ago, we'd be sitting here, and we've got all the horror in the hospitals, and literally people dying. But at the same time, I was thrust into this position of, okay, what am I going to do? At the time, I was doing a lot of teaching, both with Canon and with two charities, and Canon was also flying me, which they still do, across Europe, Middle East, and Africa, giving talks and workshops, talking both to people internally, but also now creators, and doing what we're doing now, podcasts and interviews and webinars and stuff. So, but then we weren't doing webinars, and so I literally they contacted me and said, this is Canon, contacted me and said, can you make a film? Because everyone was like, we need content. We need content. Can you make a film about portraiture and about lighting? So I said, yeah, sure. And it was needed very quickly. And the thing is, for me, and I don't know whether it's like this for you, Kirsten, but it's taken me a long time. Whatever career I have and whatever success that I have came late in life. And so, and I'm painfully aware of whatever you put online stays online. It's always going to be there forever. And, you take a pride, like you take a pride in what you do, in your, in your podcasts and I do and in your work, and I do the same. And so I actually couldn't physically bring myself to do this sort of 3-minute thing. So I sort of thought, well, what can I do? And so I then launched into a 12-week adventure into making a documentary. That sounds terribly immodest, a sort of documentary about myself through my work. And so I built a rostrum camera, and I then started to introduce lights, and some of the takes would take 40 takes. I then started to buy microphones, and you know what it's like. Excuse me. And I chose a set of prints, and I thought I'm going to tell the story of my work through print because I'm a big lover of print, and that's what I did. And so this sort of 3-minute sort of thing that was needed to almost fill a gap in a sense for me became a 20-minute documentary with, I think, in the end, like 180 something separate setups. And it involved my cat, and I told these stories through just holding the prints under a rostrum camera. And I do these cutaways, and I go and make a cup of coffee. And all the time, I'm building this what I've got now. And I was immensely proud of the film that I've made. It was called Home. And to be fair to Canon, although I didn't deliver, I sort of, everyone else was sort of delivering. I said, they were saying, where's your film? Where's your film? I said, well, look, I'm going a different direction. And I've done this so many times in my career, but I think you'll be happy, I hope. And they were. And in fact, they finished off, it was called Canon Connector. And I think they finished off by showing my film as the very last one. And it wasn't 3 minutes, it was like 20 minutes. And I'm still immensely proud of that film to this day. And I had to wait. In those days, I wasn't lighting it like this, so I had to wait for the Velux window and shoot at certain times of day. And but it just taught me so much, because I then, I was shooting. I think I was shooting off the EOS R, and I got it on it was full of focus, which was really lovely. And I do these cutaways, and then I'd then get the files into Premiere. And at the time, I was just the sort of, a very, very not a great Premiere user. I'd come from InDesign, I'd come from not even Photoshop, really, mostly Lightroom, and then I was thrown into Premiere, and I had to learn. I had to learn how to use Premiere. I had to learn how to use Audition. I had to learn how to get sound levels, all the things that other people did for me. So I would talk to the other people, and I have a sound designer in London, and he would help me. And because we were all like in this position, what do we do? Mm-hmm. And you know what? COVID taught me so much about filmmaking, because I was like forced into this space. So for 12 weeks, I literally worked probably 12 hours a day, every day, for 7 days a week. And I made this 20-minute film, and you can see it online, and I still share it to this day. But that process of being sort of forced to do that taught me so much. And now, of course, I have the system where I have the Rode mics, the Focusrite preamps, that it's all lit. I've got my Atomos. I'm going out of one camera, and there's a decoder going into another computer, which means I can reach you. And it's quite a complex sort of system. And this is how I run workshops from here. And this has become such a big part of my sort of life now. But COVID caused that for me to happen. And there's a lot of investment, it involved a bounce back loan and a lot of investment. But I actually, and at that point in my life, in my 50s, I learned so many new skills. So many. But, coming back to what you said about content creation and the amount of time you have to do it, the only way I can see that working, because sometimes I was in Edinburgh last week and I was working with young people, and I will use the smartphone and I'll shoot clips of the guys working. I'll then take their work out of their Canons, and then I'll combine that in edits. But I did an edits film from Edinburgh, which again you can see on my social media, and I shot a few clips around the guys. I'm talking about the young people. Got had their files because I was going through the edits with them. We had 5 schools over 2 days in Murrayfield, so it kind of had this sort of. It was the first time we've done a big kind of young people program in Scotland. And you know what? That edit that I did in edits took me, I think, a day and a half just to do the edit in edits.
Right.
So I'm using edits like you might use Premiere now.
Yeah.
Now I was using Premiere Rush before that. I would prefer to use an Adobe workflow, and sometimes I'll use Premiere. But then if you're trying to get music, that makes it difficult. So how the whole idea of creating really great content does take days. I don't think there's any getting away from it unless there's a team of you where you can have your edit, someone who can edit quickly, someone who can shoot, and then between 3 or 4 of you, then I think maybe you can deliver, something really good, and you're doing it all the time. But to take, the way that I think you and I probably work is in Premiere and Audition, and to come from that purist sort of route is very difficult when you've got clients now demanding, like you say, I mean, impossible really. I want to see something next day.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I actually have a job coming up next a couple of weeks' time where that's the case. And it's like, I already know, because the problem with that is also it's linked to budget. Like very often with those kind of jobs, the budget doesn't allow to hire, let's say, an editor, for example. If I had an editor on this job, it'd be easy, right? I'll just, I'll create the files, they'll edit them overnight, and it's all done in the next morning. In this case, I have to do all of it myself. So I already know, like, those are 48 hours where I'm not going to get a lot of sleep, but it just, it just has to be done. It's one of these things.
I think when COVID came, you did one or two things, didn't you? You either sort of attacked it and embraced it and said, right, okay, or you sort of didn't.
Yeah.
I don't know whether there's any middle ground. But I think this goes back to that, what we were talking about right at the top, was putting yourself outside your comfort zone and being prepared to make mistakes. I mean, I remember joining a webinar with one of the camera companies. It was early days, because if you see what I'm looking at now, I mean, do you want me to show you? Do you want a quick look at all of this?
Sure. Yeah.
Do you want to? Yeah. So I can sort of show you. So this is what I'm looking at now. So this is how I drive my content. So this is Vimeo Livestream Studio, and I can switch between cameras. So I just click on a camera there. So here, for example, you just got me, but I can switch to a 2-up, and then I can switch to multiple camera positions. And this is kind of what I do a lot. And so I can share my work. So I can share my work in print. So in fact, next week I've got I'm doing a sort of webinar for Hannah Moore, and we'll be talking about paper, and you can even see the texture of paper, and you can talk about mattes and glosses, and then I can talk about equipment, what equipment I use. I can even show the screens of the printers themselves. This is quite a nice area when you're standing up. I found is a really good place to do Q&A. There's something different about standing up as opposed to sitting down, I've found. But so I can switch positions between that. So I can then sit back down again. But also, what I can do, I can obviously screen share. So just go. So here, some of the work from Birmingham Royal Ballet. So I can pull these files up. People can see this work. But one of the biggest challenges, and I don't know if you've found this at early days, was being able to share video. That was one of the toughest things I found. And
Yes.
one of the things I can do now with this, for example, let's do this now. So I can bring video in. I can actually bring in audio with that as well. So this is the documentary that was made about my latest project, the one we talked about. Let's go back to me again, and then we'll just kill that. But also, I can run keynote presentations. So, for example, so here now, I'm driving a keynote presentation, and I can actually run through my keynote a lot of the things that you and I have said. And this is how I actually. I talk to people across Canon and Maya using this system, and so I'm able to put typography and imagery together. I can share, for example, this is the film treatment for the project that I'm doing at the moment that I talked to you about, and then I can jump ahead to different parts of this. For example, very quickly, here we go. So this is just a little bit of BTS from the VR film. So I can talk about. It's a really useful system because it means I can talk about projects, but show them, show them really quickly and easily, and it means I can also share the way that I work. So, for example, in fact, we talked earlier about my influences in light, so I can share this this little film that I made about my influences in light, and then I can talk about the challenges of light in this project, and so using these visual cues and typography, because I come from a design background, I'm able to tell a story much more easily with the imagery as well as just seeing me as well, and then sometimes as here you can see some of the way that I work. In fact, if you remember, I talked earlier about the dancers. I was working practically in the dark. It was my Apple Watch, which I set to red, which is the only way that the dancers could see me. And you'll see, I think, in a moment. I'm kind of in the shadows as I'm shooting. But it's nice to be able to have this content, because it is content in effect, and I'm able to sort of, split between this, and and then share the work. I can sort of split between the work, and I can either share it in this sense, like I'm doing here, or I can then switch to the screen and I can show how I might edit this work, and I can talk about the quality of the work. And I found this to be extremely useful. But to do this took it took probably a year to build that, and I'm sure it was probably the same for you. To get to a point where you're doing the podcast, and because sound is also a really important part of it. Having the right mics, I have a Focusrite preamp here with four XLR inputs, and before I knew nothing about this stuff. I didn't know what these things were. I have Atomos Ninjas driving the content, so I have the HDMI out from the Blackmagics here to an Atomos Ninja, which fires it through a decoder into a second Mac that then joins your software, or joins a Teams meeting, or joins a Zoom meeting. And early on in COVID, people were still wrangling with, video was out. No one could join a meeting with video. And of course I could, I'd worked out ways of doing that. And I had a lot of help. There's people within Canon who were also, we all sort of shared this journey together. But it became very expensive, because the next minute, you speak to your sound designer, he says, "Oh, you need a preamp." And I said, okay, how much is that going to cost? Oh, well, that'll be 1,000, and then before you knew it was 1,000 here, 1,000 there, 1,000 there. Fortunately, I had enough cameras, but at one point I was running 7 cameras, and now I think it's 5 or 6.
It's one of
And
those
obviously
things.
the way it's lit.
It's definitely been a journey. I mean, it's very similar for me. In the very, very beginning, I started the podcast with a friend of mine, who lives about 20 minutes by car away from me. And of course, with lockdowns and everything else, it was difficult. But even just, I mean, we basically sat in our respective houses and filmed ourselves, especially for the first episode. And then the question was like, well, how am I going to get my video footage over to you? Because the files were huge. So back then, I had to drive over to Eton with the SD card, put the SD card on the roof of his car, call him and say like, okay, I've done the drop, and then I would drive off. He would come out the house, pick up the SD card, and then, load up the footage and edit the thing. It was unbelievable, and through
You become very creative, don't you? You become very, very, you become very resourceful. And I think that's just human nature. When we're sort of forced into a corner, and you don't go into, it's not a survival mode. Well, to a degree, it was actually. No, that's not that. To a degree, it was, because it's like, how do I extract a living in this situation? So I continued to get commissions. In that, I would still teach. So I was teaching all through COVID. Young people, and some of the work that the young people produced was extraordinary, incredibly dark, but extraordinary. So I would, and still now I, work with schools. I can work remotely, so I'll do a hybrid form of work. And now I mentor people and teach people, and they can either come here and work with me here, or I can do it remotely, like this. So I use all of these tools to be able to continue to work in a remote sense. And I can put the feed into the backs of cameras. I can explain about face recognition, eye recognition. But most of all, I've got all this, decades of content that, I drive and can bring into or lean on pretty much at any point, and bring in video like in an instant. In an instant. If the conversation went in a direction, I could bring something up. So, yeah, we did this and we did that. But I think, excuse me, I think what's interesting about where the world's going right now is how do you stay relevant? How do you extract a living? You've obviously found a way of doing that through podcasting. And I'm very happy to join and feel very privileged to be part of this. And how do we stay relevant? I think it's probably the biggest question out there. I teach young people, and they want to know what their career path might be if they go into photography. And I say, well, I think you need to keep your options pretty open.
Yeah.
Think about moving image, think about stills, but also, I have multiple careers. I write, I speak, I teach. I'm now doing mentoring. I'm working on my first workshops. Like the one that you saw at the photo show. I'm going to be creating those, of my own with Birmingham Royal Ballet. So you've just got to get very creative, and you either go with that brief that you're doing next week, or you don't. I don't think I could do it, frankly, Kirsten, what you're doing next week. I actually don't think I could do it. But I admire the fact that you do it. And then we're met with the other situation where contracts. So clients are now asking photographers to just give away their IP, their copyright, which is a big no-no in my opinion. Never ever give away your, the usage. Unlimited usage, box ticked. I mean, that's it. You can forget about it. And now, of course, there's other terminology. I think it's an American terminology. I forgot what it is now, but where, your work can be used for AI purposes too. They call it hire, but it's not. So it's very complicated.
Yeah, there's been a development recently, which I've noticed, where I've gotten this is definitely, I can blame ChatGPT on that, where I get requests for quotes, right, on jobs that are so detailed it is bordering the ridiculous. Like, let's say, it's a commercial job, like headshots, blah blah blah, event shots, whatever, and it literally details everything down to the focal length that I'm supposed to use. Like
What?
yeah, 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 and it's so blatantly obvious that somebody in middle management is going to ChatGPT and going like, oh, I need to write a detailed brief, blah blah, and and I've gotten multiple of those over the last 3 months, and I'm thinking, every time, to be honest with you, every time I've replied with an outrageously overinflated quote. Because I'm thinking, okay, well, if you want me to do that, you're going to pay
That's
for it.
definitely one way to do it. Yeah, for sure. And good for you too. Good for you too, because I think this whole we used to have a term when I was a graphic designer. Still am a graphic designer, but we'd have this term, design by committee never works.
Yeah,
Never works.
absolutely.
If and I've had this as a director. I've had clients try and I mean, I remember we did one film and a client um basically, so Tristan, my editor, and Tristan, many years experience, and I mean, we're working with great cinematographers as well. Chris Clark, who done 3 Bond films, 3 Harry Potter films, and I was directing, but I was second camera, and et cetera, et cetera. But I remember one time I had a client actually send an Excel spreadsheet with the time codes on it, wanting us to move this shot from here to here and extend that by this and do that and do this. And I remember my producer Mark just sending an email back just saying no. That was it. No. Um, and it. The thing is, if you commission a creative, a director, a photographer, whether it be an illustrator, your hope is that you're being commissioned because you bring your tone of voice, you bring the way you see the world, you bring your look, your feel, you bring you to it, don't you? I'm not comparing myself to these directors, but if it's a Christopher Nolan film, it's a Christopher Nolan film.
Exactly.
You know what you're going to get. No one tells him what to do, and I know these guys, but I'm sure there are thousands of directors, under there where the studios are just absolutely there's committee meetings taking place, and basically as a result, the work just becomes bland, just becomes fluff, you know. And this has happened in advertising. Let's not forget, this has happened in British advertising. We were the world's best in advertising, for sure, in the sort of through the 70s and 80s. And now you've really got to look for the great ads. They're still there. There's still one or two great ones there. But I remember when you'd look forward to the adverts. You would literally look forward to them because they were so amazingly good. And of course, guys like Ridley Scott came from advertising.
Yeah, it's a crazy world we live in. On one hand, the opportunities, that we have through technology to do the things that were unthinkable before COVID, which has certainly pushed that side. But on the other hand, like I mentioned, like we mentioned, those completely unrealistic client expectations that are sort of a direct result of that, they've definitely changed, I think, the landscape of photography in general, and the demands you know, on photographers, on professional photographers, not only like in the advertising world, but just general, working photographers out there. I tell you what's interesting.
Yeah,
Sorry,
go on,
go ahead.
sure, please. Yeah.
I did a talk not too long ago called "Photography is Dead," where I looked through the history of photography all the way back to like 1843 or whatever. Because I remember as a kid, my grandmother used to tell me photography is dead, and then my dad told me photography is dead on certain occasions, and of course, I can only over the last 10 years, people were saying photography is dead when mirrorless came out, and then AI and all the rest of it. And so I thought, like, why don't I just look back through history and figure out all of the different instances or moments when apparently photography was dead.
Mm.
Whether that's photography, the emergence of photography in the first place, when all artists and painters, were of the opinion that art was dead at that point, and then when it went from plates to film and from medium format, or from medium format to 35 mil, and
Yeah.
I mean, there's so many instances where people thought that photography
Mm.
was dead, and the sort of the end result was really the realization that we've been here so many times before, so many
Yeah.
times in the past, photography had been dead and buried, and yet it's always continued in a different form and shape,
Yeah.
but
Uh,
still being relevant.
I, I I agree. I think it. And listen, that it's very easy to be judgmental, to be negative about about these ridiculous deadlines and about content creation, and to also look back, and it's like make photography great again almost. um it it's different. The landscape's changed, so we have to change with it. We have to adapt, and we have to accept that. And one of the great things that we have now that we didn't have back then is we have smartphones, and that same smartphone that is pumping out 2 trillion pictures, every year, is also a vehicle for us to talk to the world. And I was hearing a story. I don't know the guy's name, the young director who'd made his first film, put it on YouTube, and now I think he's directing a movie. He's only 20. Now, when we have now got the means to. I could be sitting here in on the edge of the Derbyshire Peak District, shoot pictures. I shoot my work at Birmingham Royal Ballet, come back. I'll do a collaboration, by the way, with Birmingham Royal Ballet and sometimes with Canon. So we'll get great sort of engagement with that content. But that work that's very highly crafted on my ISO here, from my R5 Mark II, is then put into Instagram, sometimes put into a reel, sometimes put into a carousel. Sometimes we'll have as many as 15, or even sometimes more pictures in that carousel. Put the words and the story with that, and then ping, it goes out to the rest of the world. Well, that's incredible, isn't it? So you kind of have to look at this and think, and just like you with the podcast right now, go on YouTube, people will see it. Hopefully people will, be inspired with it. It'll go on iTunes or Spotify, and somebody will draw or glean something from that. And it means that we have, the individual's never had so much opportunity and been so empowered, in a sense, to be able to reach the wider audience. I mean, look at LinkedIn. I mean, people, might, understandably maybe critical of social media, but look at LinkedIn. I mean, some of the people I've connected with in LinkedIn, I have to pinch myself sometimes, who I talk to. And I've never, there's never been a time in history where you can actually think, oh, I really admire that person. You send an invite or your message or whatever, and then they come back and they look at your work and say, oh, I love what you're doing. I really like that. And, and and for me, I have a great story that sort of backs this whole thing up. When I went from, I said I was directing the sort of commercials and 50 crew, and it was very exciting. It was very stressful. And to sort of go away from that, I went with the one camera and a handful of lenses to Scotland, to this Scottish island that I know well, and I wanted to shot the sort of lives of people of a Scottish island, which then grew into a bigger project about volunteers in the Royal National Lifeboat Institution. But I started to shoot pictures of these people, of the Scottish landscape. This island, which is called Islay, the biggest whiskey distribution or the biggest whiskey producer in the world. And if you like whiskey, you'll know some of those whiskies like Ardbeg, and Lafroig and Lagavulin and Bamore, etc. So I start shooting these portraits purely for passion, personal project. Canon saw this work and said, we really like what you're doing. This would be great in print. And I said, great. So then Canon then get involved and start, and then they have a chat about it in their marketing team for Image Prograph, LFP. And then it becomes, I get funded to go to this place that I love for 3-4 trips. And then my agent, Mark George, gets a phone call from Paris, and it's from Louis Vuitton Mark Hennessy, one of the marketeers there, and said, "We've seen Clive's work. It's really gritty. It's completely the opposite of everything we see on the island, which is a bright sunny day. He's done this really gritty sort of, and it's how I felt. So my photography is very much about how I feel. So I choose those gritty days, those overcast days, those wet days, and I shoot people in this sort of very sort of almost over textured way. And they said it's perfect for our whiskey brand Ardbeg. And then, completely out of nowhere, I get a phone call from my agent saying, "Clive, got good news." Phone call from Paris. Ardbeg want you to shoot their social media campaign. And do you know what? I shot the Ardbeg social media campaign for, I think it was 3, maybe 4 years. And they paid for me to go to Scotland maybe 3-4 times a year to shoot their social media campaign on big cameras. So none of that would have happened if I hadn't been posting on social media, hadn't been using LinkedIn. I don't use YouTube, although I have a lot of content on YouTube. And I should do, let's be clear, I should do. Maybe I should do TikTok, but I do. My main predominant focus is on Instagram and on LinkedIn. I stopped using X for other reasons, like most everybody else, I think. And Facebook too, because there's a particular market that likes Facebook. But there's never been a time. So like this. So I encourage young people. There was a young lad, a friend's son, who just won a great competition the other day. He's 19. And I said, get yourself on LinkedIn, get this work on, get this story on. You've just won this major competition. Get that story out there. Link up with me. I'll link with you. And so, it's like you've kind of carved this sort of niche, haven't you, for doing these podcasts, and many other people find other ways of sort of extracting a living at it. I think for many of us, we'll never be sort of millionaires, but I just want to be able to be an artist, and whatever that might be, whether it's photography, it's film, or writing, or even speaking, or whatever, and just make enough to live and just feel fulfilled and challenged, and have purpose.
And that's a perfect phrase to end this episode with. Clive, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on the show. Thank you so much. There was so much wisdom and golden nuggets.
Well, from you too. I mean, I draw a lot of inspiration from what you're doing, a lot. And I think one of the things that I learned early on is that we all must learn from each other. And every day's a school day, as many of the people I respect most say to me.
Absolutely. Clive, thank you so much for being the guest on the Camera Shake podcast.
Thank you.
Okay, folks, that is it for today. It was awesome having Clive on the show. What a masterclass in cinematic lighting and storytelling. And as always, before we go, let me just recommend another episode I think you'll really enjoy. Check out episode 266, where we dive into why collaboration is one of the most important things in photography with Mark Wallace. I'm sure you get a ton of value from that. If you enjoy our content, consider supporting us over on buymeacoffee.com/camerashake. It really does help us continue creating and bringing you more episodes like this. I don't know why I keep saying us. It's really just me, but there you go. And don't forget, you can now grab Camera Shake merch over at camerashakepodcast.com and support the show in true style. And for those of you listening to the audio version of this podcast, did you know that there's a full video version over on YouTube with loads of visual examples of our guest work? Well, just head over to YouTube and search for Camera Shake Podcast, and you'll find all of our past episodes over there. And if you're already on YouTube, drop us a comment, hit the like button, ring the bell, and share with your friends. Your engagement really helps us reach a wider audience all over the world. So thank you for listening and watching. And remember, a new episode drops every Thursday, so mark that in your calendars, diaries, whatever your kids use these days. Until next time, keep shaking things up in the world of photography. See you next Thursday.